The American Teilhard Association podcast features conversations and interviews which explore the life, thought, and vision of mystic scientist Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. We express our gratitude to Dalesford Abbey in Paoli, Pennsylvania, for allowing us to use their space and equipment in making this episode possible. Dr. Christine Tracy is a writer, journalist, rhetorician, and Teilhardian scholar. She holds a Ph.D. from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, where she studied the evolution of media and worked as a founding editor of one of the internet's first e-zines. She is a member of the Council of Scholar Advisors for the Teilhard Project and has published scholarly essays exploring Teilhard's relationship to progressive disciplines, including media ecology and integral theory. She has reported for the Ann magazine, the Albany Times Union, and other news outlets, and her nonfiction work has appeared in the University of Michigan's Bear River Review. Welcome, everyone, to the American Teilhard Association podcast. Today's guest is Dr. Christine Tracy. Christine, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Andrew. It's really wonderful to be here, and thank you for all your service to the ATA.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Well, thank you for your willingness to collaborate and be a part of our podcast here. It's a new way that the ATA has begun to reach out to people who are of a like mind and a like spirit and are resonating with Teilhard's thought and everything associated with it. So grateful that we had the opportunity to connect and chat a little bit prior to our conversation. It's nice to get to know you and your story, which we'll talk a little bit about today. But the reason why we're all here is when and how did you first meet Teilhard?
I had a very poetic meeting with Teilhard. I was in my early 30s, and I had been working as a press aide for the Culinary Institute of America in Hyde Park. And part of my responsibilities were to take visitors, especially people from France and other countries, to see Teilhard's grave. Mm-hmm. And I would go with them, and I would take them, to the beautiful little Jesuit cemetery there, and stand and watch them, and wonder, wow, who is this Teilhard person that is evoking all this devotion? Mm. And it didn't just happen once, it happened, fairly frequently. I would have to go to the gatehouse and get a key to get into the cemetery. And I asked the security guard one day, how many people come to see this Teilhard fellow's grave? How many people come each day? And she said, oh, we get about one a day. And that was my first meeting. My life was very busy at the time. I had a year-old little boy, and so and all the responsibilities of a press aide. But although that was the most wonderful job I've ever had in my life. I talked about this wonderful place, including the fact that Teilhard was buried there. I ate in the kitchens, and it was a press person's dream to be able to just simply pick up the phone and host press tours.
Well, that's wonderful, and what an intimate first encounter with Teilhard. And I'm thinking of how, at least in my case, when I came to be aware of his thought, it was just, he was this guy, right? Like, he was a priest and a scientist, and he's writing about these things that, I've kind of always intuited, and now he's putting words to it. And I remember asking one of my graduate teachers at the time, I was like, have you heard of this Teilhard guy? And he was like, yeah, he's your guy. You should read him, knowing how my mind worked. And it was kind of like coming in blind, but here you're seeing this line of devotees coming in, right? These people devoted to him in some way, and you're like, who is this guy? What's he all about? I think that's pretty cool, because you maybe had a sense of his level of influence prior to actually getting to know him and his thought. That's pretty neat.
And I like to use the word destiny with my relationship with Teilhard, because I really believe learning about him, writing about him, thinking about him, interwoven with my life has been my destiny. And it was like a tap on the shoulder. And perhaps whenever I get too far away from that energy and from that vision, I'd get another tap on the shoulder from Teilhard that would say, "Hey, pay attention again. Here I am."
Yeah, that's a great point. It's this very personal relationship that we start to develop with not just Teilhard, but the saints too. In that way, I feel like coming from the Roman Catholic tradition myself, I feel like there's that special relationship that people develop in that way. But yeah, now professionally, your background is very interesting because it is so relevant to our media climate today, the technological environment today. You studied for your doctoral studies communication and rhetoric. So, what inspired you down that path?
Well, when I went back to get my master's and doctorate at Rensselaer, I had been working as a journalist and working as a public relations person, right? That's what I was doing at the culinary. And at one point, I realized if I didn't get other skills, I would be doing that for the rest of my life. Um, I had, after my children were born, I worked as a copywriter, which was a good job, paid well, but I knew I needed more skills. And I was really lucky enough because I lived in upstate New York near the little uh, technological university, Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, which back in the day people called RPI, and now they call it Rensselaer. I guess a little more updated, a very old school. And that was right in my backyard. So I started slowly working on my master's degree in communication, and then was lucky enough to get a full scholarship for my doctorate. And the exciting thing about being at Rensselaer then was it was the very, very beginning of the internet. I had access to really good computers and also really beautiful minds.
Mhm.
I knew how to, at one point, hand code HTML, which is the backbone, the language of the internet. And a handful of graduate students and I were able to produce a monthly magazine that went all over the world. And I realized later that my studies in communication and rhetoric were really valuable to me in helping to do my research in online news delivery.
Okay. Yeah, like I said, it's very apropos to our media climate today and how massive a role media plays in our everyday lives and the many forms that it has now taken on, right, in terms of digital media, short form video clips, all of these things they're quite overwhelming. So, coming from your background in kind of the early days and the like mass dissemination of information and media, what are your insights now on how that landscape has evolved?
I think the biggest change, and remember that I started working in the early 90s,
Mhm.
right, was the fact that instead of simply being consumers of information, the average person could become a content creator, could
Mhm.
actually disseminate information. I was an undergraduate at Villanova University, and actually, it's so fortuitous too, perhaps a piece of destiny, that I was there and graduated in 1977 when Pope Leo did.
Oh, very cool.
We were there together, and I imagined maybe we went to Sunday Mass at 6 o'clock at the beautiful St. Thomas of Villanova, little mini cathedral,
Yeah.
the campus that's just so very beautiful. Or maybe we were at commencement together. But while I was there as an undergraduate, I had did an internship at the Norristown Times Herald Record.
Okay.
And right, and so this was maybe 1975, 1976, and my editor took me downstairs to the press room. So I got to see how the newspaper was actually produced, and it was
Hmm.
produced in these big wooden trays filled with type, right? So if you were going to say the American Teilhard Association, you'd have to put in a T and an H and an E and a little block to space it all out, right? Everything we read in the paper was actually a small piece of type that the presses
Mhm.
run over. So now here I am as a graduate student at Rensselaer, sitting in front of a computer, being able to do exactly what this news organization was doing without presses, actually without very much money, right?
Mhm.
We only use the computers. And so the biggest shift is that we are content creators.
Mhm.
Scott Gant wrote a book in 2007 called We Are All Journalists Now.
Mhm.
So some of the gatekeepers that perhaps, and I believe many of us maybe miss them, and people of my generation who may be listening, people like Eric Severide and Walter Cronkite and Huntley Brinkley, the Associated Press, United Press International, there were whole systems of vetting and gatekeeping and sourcing and disseminating information that
Mhm.
we don't have, that we have some of that now, but it's the landscape is very, very different.
Yeah, it's fascinating how the decentralization of media and news has really impacted people where, like you said, almost anyone, and you don't even really need substantial financial resources, can go on Amazon and on a very limited budget get a decent
Right.
camera if they don't want to just use their phone, and decent podcasting equipment or whatever. And before you know it, you can have your own platform and you're spreading news, you're spreading information or misinformation in some
Right,
cases.
right,
Yeah, and I think it's like a double-edged sword where there is a great challenge to that decentralization of media, obviously, where you have people spreading misinformation or hurtful information. It's being heavily politicized or whatever it is to have it have a certain bent or angle to it. But then it's also created somewhat of a level playing field where you can have some really strong journalists out there that are independent and they're doing really phenomenal work that the major networks don't want to touch because things are so politicized and the money changes hands and there's all these layers to things. So yeah, I mean, I like to think that we're working through a lot of different bottlenecks during this evolutionary period we're in now. And one of those that we can see and even in some cases feel most viscerally is media and how that's evolving and changing. And unfortunately, it's forming some echo chambers, but then it's also really opening perspectives in other ways that if you're just tuning into a box at a certain time every night,
right.
you might not get that level. So yeah, it's that's kind of evolution, right? It just provides us with these great opportunities, and there's so much potential where sometimes we can wander down a blind alley, but there is an opportunity there for life to recalibrate and redirect
Right,
and
right.
really, find something that is more sustainable. So, Christine, how do you see this evolution over time impacting our culture?
I think the biggest impact is on shifts in literacy. That some of the traditional ways we were taught to take in information, to read it, right? I went to wonderful Catholic grammar schools where I was taught handwriting, right? Where I was taught how to write in cursive. So much of that is changing now. Now we need thumbs on, how fast can our thumbs move on our cell phones? With shifts in media, there are things that happen. It's a paradox, actually. There's great affordances, but also great constraints.
Mhm.
We are now living in that time of unity consciousness that Teilhard de Chardin envisioned, and how exciting that is, that all we can be in touch with people all over the world. I remember the moment when I was talking to a friend of mine on my cell phone and he lived in New Zealand. And there I was talking to him on my cell phone, halfway around the globe. And so there are great affordances, the ubiquity, the accessibility, the volume, the ability of smaller, less resourced writers and filmmakers to be able to do their work is wonderful. The constraints, however, is that I really think have become somewhat more disconnected,
Mm.
that those connections that we believe are real, right? Like you and I are here together in this moment, but we're not really together.
Mm.
And there's a disconnection from other people, some disconnection from ourselves, and
Sure.
perhaps I feel like the most dangerous is a disconnection from the earth
Mm.
to because the technology is so pervasive that it could make us feel like and so immersive that this
Mm.
is the real. This is, what's happening. And actually, there's lots of research being done now in cognitive science about young children's brains, that people
Mm.
are actually learning differently.
Yeah.
One of the things that I think is really important is to continue to have the intense print engagement, the
Mhm.
textual literacy, and what happens when we're engaged in reading a text for a long period of time,
Mhm.
like we do when we read books. When we read the human phenomena, what does that require of us?
Yeah.
This is simply being more passive.
Mm. Mhm. Yeah, that's a really important point you make there about media literacy, um, because I've seen it on both ends of the spectrum, and I'm sure that, I'm holding my own bias in some way personally, but folks who are a lot older tend to believe whatever they read or see on the screen, as folks who are younger and maybe less informed about the world are also very inclined in that way. Um, and, I'm sure, again, I'm holding a bias in that way, but um, I kind of feel like my generation was raised at a point where this technology really started to ramp up. And we were almost forced, sink or swim, to kind of keep up with it. Because I feel like I'm going to be 38 next month. And I feel like right now I am kind of treading water to keep up with like technology and just how to have a basic sense of how to use new technologies and whatnot. A lot of it is bandwidth and time, and just like with raising a young family with my wife, like I don't have time for a lot of stuff or desire to get into something, but I see how quickly my children, who are all young, have just picked up technology from grabbing my phone or my wife's phone or the family iPad or something like that. And it's just so intuitive for them. I'm really curious about how their literacy in terms of that technology, will pan out in the long run there. I'm hopeful for it for sure. Um, we don't not to get overly personal, but my wife and I are intentional about the amount of time that the kids can spend on screens and devices and stuff like that. So you strive for a semblance of balance in that way, but it's more that overarching curiosity of like these kids were raised with technology that I couldn't have even dreamed of when I was a
Right.
child. It was the stuff of sci-fi, and now it's just so native for them. What's that going to be like, right? I believe I am a digital immigrant or something like
Mhm.
that. My generation is called. And then these are the digital natives or something like
Yes,
that.
I've heard those expressions. And I choose to believe, I think Teilhard would believe too, that we're moving towards better, we're evolving towards better, and that these are our tools, and we've designed these tools to help us bring about the noosphere, to
Mhm.
help us live in the noosphere and to share the information in conscious and loving ways.
Mhm.
To me, that's the excitement. And I just turned 70 this year, so I'm very grateful that I can stand in this moment and look back and also look forward as I have four grandchildren, and how exciting it is to see them grow and change and use technology. My husband and I were recently in the UK, and we happened to be in London during the VE parade, the Victory Europe parade.
Mhm.
And so there we were, standing and, with throngs of Londoners and people from the English and other people watching the parade go by. And both of our fathers were in World War II. And we started sharing some of those stories,
Mhm.
right? Like different kinds of stories. My mother told me stories about what it was like to live in this country while the war was going on. And we realized how important it is that our grandchildren, that we communicate these stories with our grandchildren. We each had stories of our father's histories, but that we were afraid some of those family stories might get lost when we're gone. And
Mhm.
so that archive capacity, I think, of the media that we have now is important. And the fact that as individuals, we have really powerful tools to
Mhm.
make video histories for our families or other kinds of things.
Yeah, it's a very interesting point you make too about history and how these new technologies can allow us a an avenue or a mode through which we can maybe re-engage with our history. Like, I know for a while, and some people still do it now, but like the DNA testing was very popular, 23andMe and Ancestry and all that to, get a sense from like a saliva sample or whatever it is, where your family originates from around the globe. And that's cool and everything, and that tells a little bit about the story, right? But what you're talking about is something much more personal, something much more deeper in that way. And I mean, people speculate about being able to upload consciousness, and you
Mhm.
could then, in theory, have like the Walt Disney thing where no one really dies; they're just kind of, suspended animation and then reanimated or something like that. I think that's Walt Disney, right?
Yeah.
Suspended animation.
Jennifer, yeah, Jennifer Egan also wrote a book called Candy House.
Okay.
That's actually the plot line where
Oh
people
yeah.
actually upload their consciousness. And as I was saying, in terms of affordances and constraints,
Mhm.
there are constraints,
Mhm.
right? If you load all your memories up online, then other people, you can see as an advantage of how some of your actions have greatly impacted other people. It's a great shift in perspective. But
Yeah.
then the downside of that, the constraint of that, is that what kind of autonomy or the sense of self or identity that we may have spent a lifetime building
Yeah.
could be eroded too. It's an exciting time.
Yeah, yeah. I'm
Exciting
just
time
thinking
to
of
be
like
alive.
how some people like on their deathbed have that conversion experience where they have a revelation about how close they were or weren't to their children or something, and then in that last moment they really want to try and outreach and make it up in some way, or make some final statement that just expresses their being sorry or being grateful or something like that. And maybe some of these technologies are making it so it doesn't need to get to someone's deathbed to have those realizations in a way regarding especially family, community, one's history, one's tradition. These are things that we're seeing impacted in so many ways, not just by technology, but with the evolution of culture and how religion had, for a while, kind of fallen out of favor at the expense of rationalism and scientism. But now it seems like there is this cultural shift talked about in the last episode. Back towards the church for a lot of people, especially like back towards even orthodoxy and these really these practices that have a high degree of interior engagement with them, right? Moving beyond the Jesus-ism that Christianity has become for a lot of people and moving really into that notion of what does it mean to put on Christ, like Paul talks about, right?
Right.
It doesn't mean to take that challenge on. It doesn't mean that all of a sudden you are, the Messiah in any way, but rather it's having, like you said, growth into a more unitive level of seeing and being in relationship with ourselves and the world and one another. And that's not easy. That demands the entirety of our being. So Teilhard talks about how our approach to Omega won't be inspired by like a common cause or action, but rather it's this desire for being, this desire for wholeness and healing, I think that we all have. And I'm curious how some of these modalities will enable people a greater sense of interiority. I know AI is now being folded into that conversation. People are consulting ChatGPT as a therapist instead of a therapist, right? Like they're saying, like, I'm going through this situation with my significant other. How can I respond better or whatever, be more compassionate
Yes.
listening? Like I've listened to some podcasts where people have talked about using it in this way, not personally how I might spin it, but I mean, it's still rather just fascinating for better or worse. It's just really quite
Right.
intriguing. It is a step toward, like I said, evolution has this freedom to it, right? That Tara talks about. And sometimes, yes, it leads us down a way which may not be the best or too fruitful or just, but we can explore that. We can course correct. We can redirect. And I'm really wondering at how some of these more, conscious technologies, as we're labeling them, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, things like that, really will tap into that, what you refer to as that unitive consciousness, right? Really will help us start to move us towards that.
Right. Those are all super exciting thoughts. And one of the themes throughout my life and throughout my study of Teilhard and my interpretation is about evolution. That, it's evolution on a grand scale, but also evolution on a very personal scale. And I believe that all these technologies, and I've seen them operate that way in my life, are
Mhm.
pushing me to be the highest and best self that I can be. And there's pressure points at all those times, right? And I've taken so much inspiration in my own life from Teilhard's life that it was not an easy life.
Mhm.
Like one of my favorite quotes, I don't know if I can say, I have to say one of because I have so many favorites,
That's fair.
is the whole of life lies in seeing, and the purpose of life is to develop more perfect eyes. And if we see these tools that we have now that we didn't have before, that I certainly didn't have when I was, even in my 30s like you, then we have the potential
Mhm.
to perfect this vision.
Mhm.
But ultimately, it's us, right? And my other favorite quote is, we are the axis and arrow of evolution.
Mhm.
And some of what's the most exciting for me about Teilhard's work and the power and these times, especially as we apply them immediately to our lives with all this technology, is where does our power come from?
Mm.
Where is that, that moment, that fire of love that's going to propel us forward? And it's almost like a cauldron that needs to, I think, grow inside, because it feels like there's more and more pressure
Mm.
from the outside of what's real, what's true. What are
Mm.
we going to bring forward? How are we going to move through these spaces, and especially move through spaces with other human beings who think and believe differently than we do, and to continue to stay open.
That's key right there. How do we move through that with others in relationship, right?
Right,
And
right.
something else I wanted to bring to the front here that you mentioned a little bit earlier was how this increased level of technological connectivity has in some ways resulted in a decreased level of physical connectivity and the connectivity that we achieve through relationship with other people, with ourselves too, and certainly with the planet. And I just think of how there is such implicit connection within nature, within the ground beneath our feet that we are just quite unaware of unless you're studying that stuff or you're a hobbyist in some way with
Mhm.
gardening or nature or whatever. It's going to be rather unknown to you. And how there is now a level of connectivity that we can have that rivals that within nature almost, I would say, or is maybe close to rivaling it. But because we lack that sense of awareness, that consciousness of our connectivity to nature, of our connectivity to our own bodies. I
Mhm.
think when you look at just, uh, the public physical health of America and the mental health, it's just like we're not in relationship with our bodies and minds, right? It's then implied that we can't be spiritually well either, fully spiritually connected if those other points are connected. Um, yeah, and how much work we have to do to really reestablish that sense of awareness with our planet and especially with the other earthlings that we share this space with. We all come from that same space, but yeah, some great points you make there. And a question I have to advance us forward here that builds off of what you were just talking about. Um, how can we discern truth and authenticity in what is now being dubbed as a post-truth age?
Um, my new book, Just Trust Life, My Journey with Teilhard, is my third book about Teilhard, and my first book is called The New Sphere: Understanding the News and Information Environment, that I wrote for Peter Lang in 2012. And the way I answered that question then, I think, is even more true now, that real truth evolves over time. That truth it, it's not an immediacy. It's
Mhm.
something that we engage with and that we individually and collectively create.
Mhm.
There have been great pressures on that now in the world,
Mhm.
and to have a monopoly perhaps on what is true, and even more dangerous to think that you might have a monopoly on the truth, and that challenges to those truths are fought in great big battles. And what I'd like to share as an illustration, perhaps, is how I personally managed and took in the news of what happened here recently in Boulder, Colorado,
Mhm.
when there was a very violent hate crime. It was just about 10 days ago. Um, and it happened at in front of the Boulder courthouse, where just about every single week, a group of protesters march in support of the Israeli hostages. And what happened was someone threw Molotov cocktails and actually attempted to set and did set some of the protesters on fire. And this all happened within I live within blocks of that. So I first found out about it from my husband, who saw it on an app called Nextdoor, which many of us may get, right? We get neighborhood information that way. And then we were driving up to see my son and grandchildren, and I started looking online. I did a search on X and found eyewitness video. So
Mhm.
right away, within perhaps hours of the event, I could see the video of what happened. I got to my son's house not long after, and then there was coverage on the television, right? The local CBS affiliate. And my grandchildren were pointing at the screen and saying, "Oh, isn't that where we go, right near where we go to get our faces painted,
Mhm.
and where we go to get noodles and ice cream." And at that point, and I think this is really important, we shut the TV off.
Yeah.
And I made a very conscious decision in that moment that I knew what the story was and I had enough information at that point. And so I really shut off the flow of external information and
Mhm.
then really shifted to my internal navigator, right?
Mhm.
In my book, I talk a lot about having an internal navigation system that was moving me forward. So
Mhm.
I went into that space. I looked a little bit online on the way home there were notices from the city of Boulder, updates, and because there was a lockdown, there were certain places that were closed, people couldn't get to. So we knew we could get back to our house. But the barricades and the barriers were very close to where we were.
Mhm.
And I honestly left the story alone and gave myself space to be with it until that evening when I turned on the PBS NewsHour. And I am a journalist. I taught journalism for a long time, and the PBS NewsHour is one of my favorite sources. And Boulder and the story of what had happened, right, was the lead story that night. And so I got some new information. I didn't know that one of the victims was a Holocaust survivor. I didn't know up until that point how many people had been injured. And again, so I took that in, I shared it with my husband, and again, I took some space with it. A couple days later, when I felt ready, I actually walked down to the courthouse to see the site of where it all happened. There were some news cameras, there was a news tent set up, but you could get fairly close to the courthouse steps. There's a memorial. And I actually talked to some of the security people who were there who were eyewitnesses and asked them what it was like to be there, how long it took for the police to get there,
Mhm.
which really wasn't very long. And perhaps this is the most important part. I walked the 2 blocks to my house from there, and Andrew, I started to cry because I felt the story. I felt the
Mhm.
impact of the story. I was able to let it in through that process.
Mhm.
And I'm sharing this now because I think that bringing the level of consciousness and bringing my essence, the qualities I have of being a conscious and evolved human to that story is
Mhm.
really important. And that the truth will come when we bring that presence to it, when we make demands on as news consumers of the news environment. And at this point, you can be blown away and bombarded. We all know that by different stories, but perhaps the discovering the places of our power, of
Mhm.
where we can take ownership in this media ecology and assert our power. I love the Q&A biography of Teilhard, because in that biography, there's a story of Teilhard in World War I when he put the body of one of his friends on his back and brought it back into the trenches. And that vision, that internal vision that he had, that helped him to see in the dark, to see through danger, to not be overtaken by fear. Those are all the things that we need now. And this isn't a world war, but there is a disinformation war, right? Where I believe we all have to be soldiers for the truth now. And the truth starts with that little ember inside of us and just grows bigger and bigger.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier this quote from Teilhard about how our vision is critical, right? We must, or the whole lies in seeing, right? Um, so how would you say that Teilhard's vision is most present with you currently, especially through this most recent trying event that happened in Boulder? Today is June 10th. We're recording this podcast. So, like you said, that was about 10 days ago that happened. This podcast will probably come out in a couple weeks just so people have a sense of where we are on the timeline here. So, what from Teilhard's, and I don't mean to take you back into that place of hurt, but as you were doing that very intentional journey along with this media story that's coming out, and one of the most important parts that I liked you mentioned, or I thought most important parts, was that you just shut everything off and you took a minute to internalize it. I think that's something that we're really lacking. But what part of like Teilhard's thought or vision was most present with you while you were going through that journey?
Um, the part that's really the most present for me is that his letter to two friends,
Hmm.
the that poetic piece that I used as the title of my book, that the part that says, just trust life.
Mhm.
Life will take you high if only you believe that it's going somewhere.
Mhm.
Um, and I do believe that. I do believe that all of this, and this is the challenge, I believe, to me personally and all of us, the challenge of our times, that we are going somewhere, that
Mhm.
this is a personal and a collective evolution. The what I held on to at that time is that I have internalized this energy. It's not outside of me.
Mhm.
Through my life,
Mhm.
I it's been my destiny, almost like a helix, to be interwoven with the ideas of Teilhard that I've incorporated into my life in many different ways, and I've been grateful that I've been able to share that journey in my book. Uh, and I know it, I feel it, I
Mhm.
live it, and now it's my opportunity to share it with other people. And perhaps the piece, and thank you for that question, is to rely on
Mhm.
it, to trust that it's there when I feel confused or scared or hurt or tired, that to just trust that it's there.
Mhm. And that's so important you bring that up. We have a great tendency to just consume, consume, consume media, especially when it's being force fed down our throats in so many ways. And even if it's like, you choose to put your own phone down, then you step into the next room and someone has the TV on, or someone's all hot and bothered. Oh my God, did you just hear about what happened in Missouri or wherever, right? And it's just like, what happened now, right? And we start to get anxious and we feel like a raw nerve, and there's no inner locus of control, as it's referred to, right? It's all external, and I've got to say this to my liberal uncle, or I need to go to my conservative grandmother and make sure she knows this thing, right? It's just like, who cares? Like, because everyone has their opinion and they're quite set in it. And a lot of people don't want their minds to be changed, unfortunately. And I think a lot of that is because we are just finding a sense of comfort in parroting what we hear other people say, and we don't want to take that responsibility to hold on to that evolutionary ember, as you refer to it, within us, because it's hot, right? And that's a great theme throughout Teilhard, fire. Um, and yeah, that fire burns, but it also purifies, it molds, it helps to cast, a larger reality and hope in the future in that way too, where, like you said, it's taking us somewhere. And we do have a say in the matter somewhat, as maybe we can humble ourselves and, be open to these movements of the spirit and evolution that are flowing through us and are within us, and we are it to some degree, right? We are evolution, and to take conscious agency within it as best we can, and to acknowledge that we are not fully evolved, but that we're on the road there, and we wish to humbly and consciously take up that task as best we can, and to not do it in a way that leaves us feeling like we're just at the whims of the world outside of us. To give us an anchor is so critical. Yeah, I mean, I have one more question for you, but I'd then like to give you an opportunity to talk about your book, which you've recently written and released, because it is a memoir. It's very personal in that way. So, I'm hoping that our conversation today can give people a good primer for getting into that, where you expand on these experiences a lot more. But if you could ask Teilhard anything today, what would it be?
Thank you for this question. It's wonderful to think about. Um, I I would ask him because I believe I've learned, and I believe this is true for others, that Teilhard, through his life and his teachings, have showed us how to evolve through difficult circumstances, through suffering, through pain. And in the Christian faith and tradition, this is, considered the way of the cross,
Hmm.
right? Um, what I would like to, and I am old enough and have lived enough life to know that to be true. What I would like to know is, how do we evolve in joy?
Hmm.
How do we evolve, individually, collectively, in a way that our dear mentor Teilhard would say,
Yeah,
this is the way of joy, this is the path of joy.
great
Um,
question.
yeah, that's what I would. So, yeah.
And it's not an answer to your question via Teilhard, but it's flowing from our conversation today and the fact that we have some choice and agency in how we discern our advance forward. But Henry Nouwen has the quote where that joy is a choice, or we can choose joy. So I think, we can choose a more conscious way of living and engaging in and sharing information in this
Mhm.
very complex environment that we
Mhm.
live today.
Mhm.
So, Christine, like I said just earlier, you've just recently authored and released a book. It's called Just Trust Life, and it is a memoir of your journey with Teilhard and how he has been a great coach and empowerer for you, and inspiration for how you can, like his quote, inspires us to just trust life. So, would you please tell our audience a bit about the book and how they can find it?
Thank you. Again, this is my destiny. I started writing the book during COVID. I took a workshop on memoir writing, and the book evolved over a period of 5 years. And I believe I was able to capture some of the many lessons and the moments of my life when Teilhard actively uh, sort of tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Here I am. This is the way to go."
Mhm.
It really focuses on my doctoral work, which was one of the most challenging points of my life, when not only was I a doctoral student, just a lot was happening in my life, and how having that elevated perspective, having the internal navigation system, and knowing that I was moving forward towards something, even in the moments that were dark and difficult, helped me to internalize this energy and to really truly live it. A good way to find the book now would be to go onto my website, which is easy to remember. It's justtrustlife.com. But the book is available at Powell's, at Barnes and Noble, through Amazon. And it's also available as an ebook too.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for sharing that information with us. I will be sure to include that in the show notes where people can have a direct link to your website and we'll at least give one of the links where they can buy the book as well.
Thank
Um,
you.
so thank you for your very personal and transparent sharing of your journey with Teilhard, both today here and as well as in your new memoir. So we encourage people to check that out. We encourage people to stay plugged in with the ATA. Before we went live here today, Christine and I were talking about the recent retreat that we just had at the end of May into the beginning of June out here in the greater Philadelphia area at Dalesford Abbey. The American Teilhard Association, for as long as I've known the organization, has had an annual event. And that annual event was traditionally held in Manhattan at the Theological Union there. And it was a great event. And all it really was a talk, there was a lunch, and then COVID hit. So that kind of changed the
Mhm.
landscape. Not kind of, it did in so many ways. And we were naturally moved to Zoom for our annual events and presentations. But once things started to, it was really in 2023, we gathered for an in-person celebration in Hyde Park, where
Mhm.
our story today began with Christine's sharing about how she came to know Teilhard. And we we'd made a pilgrimage to Teilhard's gravesite, and that was a celebration of the Mass on the World, 100th year anniversary of that. And it was just such a phenomenal event. There were people from America there. The friends and family of Teilhard from France came out. And I said to the ATA president, Sister Kathy Duffy, we should really do this in person again. It's been such a powerful time together. So this was our second year in having our annual event also be a retreat. And like you were saying earlier, Christine, we're together right now, but we're not. I've even
Right.
noticed this weird effect that I don't know, it's like my vision or my spatial awareness has when I'm on a Zoom call. I'm in tunnel vision most of the time. I mean, I might have someone come and knock on my door, like whatever. But for the most part, I'm locked in. And then after I close the Zoom call out, I need a few minutes of like reorientation, like spatially to the room, my temperature regulations off and stuff like that. I'm like, wow, it's hot in here. I didn't even feel that. Um, so yeah, we're kind of not together in that way. And I heard this said so many times at this recent retreat we just had here at Dalesford was people say it's so good to meet you in person because the ATA offers these regular book studies and interest groups that we have on Zoom where people can connect, but people connecting in person is just irreplaceable in that way. So, we hope that this conversation today encourages connection, encourages conscious relationship, both between the listener or viewer and yourself and your connections that you have with other people, and especially with the news and media environment, because it's really ever more than ever, obviously, a very critical part of how we're evolving here. And very important that, we, with the very sage wisdom of Christine, go forward with intentionality, with discernment, and with interiority too, taking things to heart, taking things in, in their raw form so that we can really sit with them and process them as we best relate to them. So we're very grateful for Christine for joining us today, grateful for
Thank
all
you,
our
Andrew.
thank you, and supporters. And we'll look forward to seeing you again. Christine, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much. What a wonderful pleasure.
I look forward to connecting with you in person.
Okay, me too.
All
Next
right.
year. Okay.